It's kind of wild to think about, right? Like what you had for lunch could actually be influencing your mood or how clearly you're thinking right now.
It really is fascinating. There's this whole field, neurometabolism, that's getting a lot of attention, especially with some of the research coming out of Singapore. It's showing us just how deeply connected our bodies and brains really are.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to dig into today. This whole intricate link between metabolism, how our bodies use energy, and, well, our minds. We've got some really interesting research to look at.
Absolutely.
So we've got articles from nature.com about some groundbreaking work happening at Singapore's A-Star. Plus, there's this really insightful white paper on metabolic psychiatry from Swiss Re.
Yeah, those are great resources.
And we'll also hear directly from the researchers making these discoveries. Our goal today, to break down how metabolism impacts our brain function and mental well-being.
Basically, we're giving you a crash course in this complex but super important area.
Right. So should we start with the Singapore research?
Yeah, let's head to Singapore.
Okay, so these scientists at A-Star are really pushing the boundaries of understanding this brain-body connection.
They're leading the way for sure.
Okay, so back in 2018, this researcher, Sarah Luo, she made a pretty cool discovery about ghrelin. That's the hunger hormone, right?
Hmm.
And she found that it doesn't just send a general "I'm hungry" signal. She was working with mice and found it activates specific neurons in the hypothalamus. That's the part of the brain that controls appetite.
Wow.
When she stimulated those neurons, the mice ate more. When she deactivated them, they ate less.
So it's like a direct line for hunger right in the brain.
Exactly. Hunger isn't just this vague feeling, it's a targeted communication system happening in the brain.
Makes sense.
And then Caroline Wee, also at A-Star, took this even further in 2019. She looked at how hunger plays out across the whole brain using zebrafish.
Oh, interesting.
And what she found was there are different sets of neurons that become active depending on whether the zebrafish were like feasting or fasting.
So different neurons for different states of hunger.
Right. She described it like a seesaw. One group of neurons is active, the other is suppressed. And they only find balance when the animal is full, when they reach that feeling of satiety.
It's amazing how they can see this happening in the brain.
Right. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Yufu, he was actually Sarah Luo's mentor. He started looking at how our environment influences all of this.
Okay.
He found that with mice, just being in an environment they associated with tasty food could trigger them to overeat, even if they weren't actually hungry.
So like just the cues, the associations were enough to trigger overeating.
Yeah, so it makes you think, right? About us humans. I mean, all those restaurants, the way fast food is branded, all those bright colors and logos we connect with, tasty, often not so healthy food. Could that be subconsciously making us eat more, even when we're not really hungry?
That's a really interesting point. Like our environment could be hijacking our hunger signals.
Exactly. And then Wee's team went even deeper into how this works. They used this technique called RNA sequencing on those neuron clusters in the hypothalamus of zebrafish.
Oh, wow. RNA sequencing.
Yeah.
That's getting really specific.
Right. It's like reading the instruction manual of those neurons at a molecular level.
So they can really understand what each cell is doing.
Exactly. And they found different subtypes of these neurons, each producing different signaling molecules. One specific subtype was linked to this really intense, almost binge-like eating behavior.
Wow.
And here's the thing. Luo's research suggests this same neuron subtype might exist in mice, too.
So it could be a common mechanism across species.
Exactly. Now, Sarah Luo, her current research is focusing on how the brain receives metabolic information from the rest of the body, like the gut, the liver, the pancreas, and all of that comes through the peripheral nervous system. It's like they're still figuring out what information is being sent and how the brain decodes it all.
It's a complex system.
Yeah. And Luo has been doing some interesting work on the liver in mice. She calls the liver the gateway because everything from the gut, all the nutrients and hormones and signals, they all pass through the liver first.
I see. So the liver is like a central hub for metabolic information.
Right. And what she's finding is that there are these complex communication pathways between the gut, the liver, our immune system, and of course, the brain.
It's all connected.
Yeah. And here's a really cool idea. This liver-brain communication might act as an early warning system. So if there are potential pathogens like harmful bacteria in our food, this pathway alerts the brain.
Interesting. So like a food safety inspector in our bodies.
Exactly. And some of the neurons linked to the liver are also found in brain regions involved in stress.
Oh, wow.
So it suggests that chronic stress might actually impact how the liver functions through those metabolic pathways.
It really highlights the mind-body connection.
Right. And then there's Weeping Han. He's looking at how mom's gut health, even before birth, and the early gut microbes of our offspring can influence how certain brain regions develop in young mice.
That's fascinating. So even before we're born, our gut health is shaping our brains.
It seems like it. And he's found potential links to brain areas associated with ADHD, anxiety, and depression.
Wow.
It opens up this possibility that maybe, in the future, we could develop therapies for both metabolic and mental health conditions by targeting these early gut-brain interactions.
That would be incredible.
And all of this work at A-STAR is part of their Brain Body Initiative. It's this huge interdisciplinary effort. They've got neuroscientists, metabolism experts, even social scientists, data scientists, technology experts.
They're really bringing everyone together.
They're all focused on understanding how the brain and body communicate to keep our metabolism running smoothly. And they're specifically looking at brain regions involved in eating and learning.
It sounds like they're covering all the bases.
They're also trying to identify new secreted factors.
Yeah.
Those are substances cells release to communicate with each other. Basically trying to figure out how our cells tell the brain about our metabolic state.
It's really getting down to the nitty-gritty.
It is. Okay, so we've seen some of the fundamental mechanisms at play thanks to that Singapore research.
Yeah, really amazing work they're doing over there.
But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about this concept of metabolic psychiatry. The Swiss Re white paper really highlights this.
It's an important area for sure.
It seems like it's a formalization of an idea that's been gaining traction. It's becoming a recognized subspecialty within psychiatry.
It is.
So metabolic or nutritional psychiatry is all about this idea that metabolic dysfunction, especially in the brain, can be a big contributor to mental health disorders.
Right, and it's not just about observing a correlation. They're looking at how nutritional interventions can actually help treat mental health symptoms.
The key takeaway being that for a lot of people struggling with mental health, there might be underlying metabolic issues making things worse.
It's a really important shift in thinking.
And the Swiss Re paper points out that people with mental illness often have a higher risk of cardiovascular problems.
Oh, interesting.
You know, heart issues. The traditional thinking was that this was mainly because of lifestyle factors like smoking, drug use, medication side effects, being less active.
That makes sense.
But newer research is suggesting that maybe pre-existing metabolic dysfunction is driving both the mental health issues and the higher risk of heart disease.
So it's not just about the lifestyle factors. It could be something more fundamental going on.
Exactly. And Swiss Re, they have this data from their UK Disability Income Protection Claims Audit. It's pretty striking.
What did they find?
A huge 94% of claimants, people who had been off work for more than a year and had a BMI over 35.
Oh, okay, so a high BMI.
Yeah, 94% of them reported either mood disorders or depressive symptoms, or they had a pre-existing mental health diagnosis.
That's a very strong correlation.
It really suggests a strong link between severe weight challenges, long-term disability, and mental health.
Definitely something to think about.
Okay, so where does insulin resistance fit into all of this?
Insulin resistance is really important to understand. When we eat, especially carbohydrates, our blood glucose levels rise. That signals the pancreas to release insulin.
Right, insulin's job is to help cells take up that glucose from the blood, so it can be used for energy.
Exactly. It's like a key that unlocks the cells to let glucose in. But here's the problem. Modern diets, with all those processed carbs, they throw this system out of whack.
I was going to say, it seems like today's typical diet really messes with this.
It does. These processed carbs, they get broken down into glucose really quickly. So you get these big spikes in blood sugar, which means a big surge of insulin gets released.
Okay.
And if this happens over and over again from constantly eating those kinds of foods, your cells can start to become less sensitive to insulin.
They become resistant.
Exactly. Insulin resistance. So then the pancreas has to work even harder, pumping out more insulin to try and keep blood sugar levels normal.
And that's where hyperinsulinemia comes in.
Right. Hyperinsulinemia is having too much insulin in your blood. It often means insulin resistance has been going on for a while.
And this can be happening for years before someone actually develops high blood sugar and gets diagnosed with type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Professor Ben Bickman talks a lot about this, how insulin resistance can be silently wreaking havoc long before blood sugar levels get to that point of diagnosis.
Right. And from an insurance perspective, the Swiss Re paper makes a good point.
Hmm.
When you see high blood glucose or HbA1c in a blood test, it usually means this hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance have been going on for a long time already.
Hmm.
But directly testing for insulin levels isn't always practical.
It could be tricky, yeah.
It can be expensive or logistically difficult. But it's definitely something to consider, especially with the impact of hyperinsulinemia on overall health, including mental health.
It would be great to have more routine testing for insulin levels.
Okay, so let's bring this back to mental health. We know mental health disorders are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There are so many factors: genetics, environment, and of course, brain chemistry. But for decades, research and treatment have focused heavily on neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain.
Right, the chemical imbalance theory.
Yeah.
Especially with serotonin, that's been a huge focus in developing psychiatric medications.
Yeah. But some big meta-analyses have actually questioned whether low serotonin alone is really the main cause of depression.
It seems too simple.
It does. Like, there's got to be more to the story.
There's definitely more to it.
And we're hearing more and more about other neurotransmitters like GABA and glutamate,
Right.
and how inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain can play a role. I remember reading that glutamate, it's essential for brain function, but too much can actually be toxic to brain cells.
That's right. It's called excitotoxicity. It can contribute to all sorts of neurological problems.
So the question becomes, are these neurotransmitter imbalances the root cause of mental health disorders? Or are they the result of something else going wrong, like maybe poor metabolism in the brain?
It's a really important question. Are we looking at the cause or the effect?
Right. And so insulin, even though the brain doesn't need it to let glucose into its cells, like other parts of the body do, it seems like insulin is still pretty crucial for what happens once that glucose is inside the brain cells.
Absolutely. Insulin helps brain cells use glucose efficiently for energy.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone has insulin resistance, even if there's plenty of glucose in the blood, and even in the brain itself, there might not be enough effective insulin inside those brain cells.
Because it's having trouble crossing the blood-brain barrier.
That's right. The blood-brain barrier is very protective. It controls what gets into the brain. And for people with insulin resistance, insulin can have a hard time getting through.
So you end up with this weird situation: high blood sugar, high insulin in the body, but not enough insulin in the brain.
It's a paradox. And the result is that brain cells can't use glucose effectively. It's called cerebral glucose hypometabolism.
Cerebral glucose hypometabolism.
It's a mouthful, I know. But basically, the brain is starved for energy, even if there's plenty of fuel available.
And this is being linked to a lot more than just diabetes these days, right?
Yeah, a wide range of conditions. And this research on mitochondrial health is really important too. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells, including brain cells. They're responsible for turning glucose into usable energy.
Right.
But when they're not functioning properly, it can affect cognitive function, mental clarity, mood, even contribute to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
So that brain fog people with mental health issues often describe.
That could be a sign of mitochondrial problems in the brain.
The brain isn't getting the energy it needs.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so with all this research coming out, it seems like we're on the verge of some big shifts in how we think about and treat mental health.
Definitely. The fact that we're seeing this global rise in obesity and poor metabolic health,
Yeah.
and it's so clearly linked with mental health disorders, suggests we need to address the metabolic issues.
It's about going to the root of the problem.
Exactly.
And we're seeing specialized centers popping up, like Professor Shabani Sethi's Metabolic Psychiatry Center at Stanford. They're exploring things like ketogenic diets for serious conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And the early results are promising. They're getting funding for larger trials.
That's great to hear.
And there's Professor Murad Zidi at the University of Cambridge. He's published some important work on the link between metabolic syndrome and major depression.
Yeah, metabolic syndrome, that's high blood pressure, high blood sugar, unhealthy cholesterol, abdominal fat, all of that together.
Right. It's all tied to metabolic health. And even the UK Royal College of Psychiatry, they held a whole training event on metabolism and mental illness just this past June.
So it's gaining recognition in the mainstream medical world.
It really is. And the evidence is growing that mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain is involved in many mental health issues.
And that strategies to improve mitochondrial health could really help people.
It's like we've been treating the brain as separate from the body when it comes to mental health. But this research is showing us just how connected everything is.
We can't ignore the body when we're talking about the mind.
Exactly. And we've known for over 100 years that putting kids with severe epilepsy, the kind that doesn't respond to other treatments, on a ketogenic diet can really help control their seizures.
Oh, yeah.
It changes the brain's primary fuel source, which stabilizes neuronal activity.
It's amazing how powerful diet can be.
It is, and it's interesting how psychiatry and neurology, even though they both deal with the brain and the same metabolic pathways, have been treated as separate fields for so long.
Yeah, there's been a disconnect.
But this shift towards viewing psychiatry more biologically, like neurology, is what's leading to these breakthroughs in metabolic psychiatry.
It's about time, I'd say.
And it's not just about managing symptoms. There's even talk about the possibility of remission in some cases.
Remission. That's huge.
It is. And the Bazooki Foundation, they're really putting their support behind metabolic psychiatry.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about them.
Their son recovered from bipolar disorder through ketogenic therapy, so they've become really passionate about this field. They've given millions in research grants and started this initiative called Metabolic Mind.
They're making a real difference.
They are, and there are over a dozen clinical trials, either finished or ongoing, looking at ketogenic therapy for things like major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, even anorexia.
Wow.
Like that randomized controlled trial in Queensland, Australia, where they're comparing a ketogenic diet to standard healthy eating advice for people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
That's a big one.
And there's another one at the University of Basel in Switzerland focusing on major depression and bipolar depression. These rigorous studies are going to be so important in building the evidence for these approaches.
Absolutely. We need solid data to back up these promising results.
Right. And ultimately, it all comes back to this powerful connection between what we eat and how our brains function. Dr. Georgia Ede, she's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and a big proponent of metabolic psychiatry. She said something that really stuck with me.
What's that?
She said the most powerful way to change brain chemistry is with food, because that's where brain chemicals come from in the first place.
That's so true. It's easy to forget that our food literally becomes the building blocks of our brains.
It is. And brain chemistry is so crucial for mental well-being. And it seems like our choices around food, our eating habits, even things like exercise and sleep, all of which affect our insulin sensitivity, they have a much bigger impact on our brain chemistry than we might realize.
It's all interconnected.
It is.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How could understanding and improving your metabolic health support your well-being, both mentally and physically?
It's a great question to ask yourself.
This is a really exciting field, and it's changing so rapidly. It's definitely worth exploring and learning more about.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.